Good afternoon and welcome to Partners in Project Green's webinar, Using Native Salt-Tolerant Plants to Restore Impacted Soils. On behalf of Partners in Project Green team, I would like to thank you all for joining us. We have a very interesting topic today, as confirmed by the nearly 300 registrations. So we're really excited to bring this webinar to you. We're joined by Dr. Lindsay Cartwright from Toronto and Region Conservation Authority's Ecosystem and Climate Science team, Dr. Barbara Zeeb from the Royal Military College of Canada, Lauren Neyruth from Queen's University, Paula Bocchetto from the Ministry of Transportation, and Daniel Philippi from the Sustainable Technologies Evaluation Program. They will present their research findings on phytoremediation and share steps we can take to make our soils and water bodies less salty. We will also have a Q&A at the end, so please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to submit questions to the presenters. If you have any tech issues or would like to chat with fellow attendees, please use the chat feature. We really welcome this, and recordings and the slide will be made available after the webinar. While we meet on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we each call home. The Toronto and Region Conservation Authority respectfully acknowledges that we are situated on the traditional territories and treaty lands, in particular those of the Mississauga Nation, as well as the Anishinaabe of the Williams Treaty First Nations, the Huron-Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee. As stewards of land and water resources within the Greater Toronto Region, the Toronto Region and Conservation Authority appreciates and respects the history and diversity of the land and is grateful to have the opportunity to work and meet on this territory. For attendees who may not be familiar with Partners in Project Green, we are a program of the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority and launched in 2008 in collaboration with Toronto Pearson. PPG works to collectively advance social and environmental sustainability through knowledge sharing, technology and infrastructure implementation, and network building. We're open to any business, municipality, or individual who operates within the Greater Toronto Area in the regions of Peel, York, Durham, and the City of Toronto. So we have today's agenda on your screen. We will start with a couple of PPG updates. Our first presentation is on using native salt-tolerant plants to restore impacted soils. This will be followed by a presentation on making the Ministry of Transportation less salty, and we will end with salt management best practices. After the presentations, we will move to the Q&A session. A reminder again to add your questions to the Q&A section. Our first update is the Corporate Flood and Heat Risk Management Program. PPG has partnered with TRCA's Sustainable Technologies Evaluation Program and Ecosystem and Climate Science team to educate and empower industrial, commercial, and institutional, as well as multi-unit residential building sectors to take action to build climate resilience. You can access the free resource hub on our website. There are videos and resources on flood and heat risks, tools and actions to address them, including utilizing green infrastructure and low impact development techniques. We've also partnered with Credit Valley Conservation to deliver their Greening Corporate Grounds program to qualifying businesses in the city of Mississauga within TRCA's jurisdiction. Please use the QR code or the links provided in the chat very soon to learn more. We have an exclusive offer for PPG members. PPG member EnviroPod is offering a 10% rebate on litter traps to our members. These are catch basin inserts to trap litter on site before they enter the stormwater system and our water bodies. They fit in most storm drains and are easy to maintain, and you can again scan the QR code to get more information. And it's now time to introduce our speakers. May I request all speakers to turn on their cameras, please? Our first speaker is Dr. Lindsay Cartwright, who is a senior research analyst with the climate science team at Toronto and Region Conservation Authority. She's interested in applied ecological research related to current threats to biodiversity and the environment within the Toronto region. Dr. Barbara Zeeb, who's a professor and Canada Research Chair at the Royal Military College of Canada, is our next speaker. For 20 years, Dr. Zeeb has studied how to remediate metal, organochlorine, petroleum hydrocarbon, and salt-impacted sites in collaboration with government agencies and contaminated site owners. Lauren Neyroth has completed her Master of Environmental Studies at Queen's University. Her thesis explored phytoremediation of saline soils using Canadian native grasses, specifically halophytes. Coupled with a Bachelor of Science majoring in chemistry, Lauren hopes to pursue a career in environmental consulting. Paula Burketto is the Principal Landscape Architect with the Ministry of Transportation. Since 2010, she's been guiding the ministry with all aspects of planting, soils, tree preservation, native plants, and vegetative cover. This includes the selection of native seeds and plants that can survive and thrive in challenging conditions. And our last speaker is Daniel Philippi, who's the research scientist with Sustainable Technologies Evaluation Program at the TRCA. He has over 10 years of experience in the environmental field and has developed several flood and climate change related training programs and courses, educating homeowners, government staff, consultants, the ICI and MERB owners on the importance of adopting appropriate low impact development and stormwater management best practices. PPG would like to thank all our speakers for their time today and for sharing their valuable findings and work with us. Welcome to all our speakers. I now invite Lindsay to start the presentation.
Great, thank you so much, Shaya, and good afternoon, everyone. So today we will provide an overview of the current issue of salt in the environment, some background information on phytoremediation, the results of a pilot project we've been undertaking over the past several years related to halophytes, and some examples of implementation opportunities and resources for salt management to make sure that less salt is reaching the environment in the first place. But before we get started, we wanted to mention that this work was made possible only by this large group of committed and passionate environmental professionals, landowners, students, and funding organizations that were integral in getting this project off the ground and having it continue to this day. So thank you. Let's start by taking a step back to a more of a global perspective. So the Great Lakes are an extremely valuable resource since they contain 20% of the world's surface fresh water. They're also home to numerous unique freshwater aquatic species. Unfortunately, the Great Lakes are also subject to many threats, including those related to climate change, invasive species, land use change, as well as pollution. And today we'll focus on salt in fresh water, which is a growing concern, and how phytoremediation, or using plants to remove contaminants from soils, could be a promising part of the solution. So long-term monitoring is essential if we want to understand what's happening in the environment. So we are monitoring freshwater streams, lakes, and groundwater in the Toronto region, and the trends show that chloride, primarily from winter salt, is on the rise. So on the right, the map shows TRCA's Regional Watershed Monitoring Program stations for stream water quality. And this shows with the red circles that 36 of 47 stations actually have increasing trends in chloride. Data on chloride from one of our many inland lakes and also a groundwater well are shown on the left side of the screen. And these also show increasing trends. And we're not only seeing these increasing trends during the salting season, which is more the winter months, but also in the non-salting season, so the summer months when salt isn't even being applied. And this is a problem since chloride levels from salt are already exceeding or moving towards exceeding thresholds to protect aquatic life and human well-being. And chloride affects aquatic life in varying ways depending on the species and the amount of chloride in the system, but the effects range from reproductive or developmental issues to death or loss of complete populations of aquatic life in certain areas. Humans rely on fresh water as well for survival, and sodium and chloride in our drinking water is also a concern. Chloride is also causing a cascade of effects. For example, chloride can affect lake mixing, causing phosphorus to be released, and this can lead to algae blooms. Chloride also binds with metals to create chemical cocktails in our streams, and legacy chloride is also a concern. So when rain falls or snow melts on our roads, sidewalks, and parking lots, not all of the chloride rushes directly into the streams immediately. So legacy chloride moves from roads and other surfaces to stormwater ponds, groundwater, and soils where it's stored. And over time, this legacy chloride moves to freshwater streams and lakes. So even if we stopped salting completely right now, we would still continue to see rising freshwater chloride levels. And while it should be a priority to limit salt application in the first place, today we will be focusing on legacy chloride in soils and how using native halophytes or salt-loving plants could be part of the solution. And now I'll pass it on to Barb.
Thank you, Lindsay, and thank you everyone for being here today. So I love talking about this subject. I've spent a lot of time on it. Phytoremediation, by definition, simply refers to using plants to remediate contaminated environments. And when you think about it, plants are really incredible organisms. They have many different mechanisms by which they can remove, destroy, transfer, stabilize, or contain contaminants in soils. For this webinar on salt remediation, I'm going to focus on the mechanism of phytoextraction, where plants are encouraged to take up large quantities of contaminants, in this case salt, and we're tracking the chloride ion, and translocate it to the above ground tissues. Unfortunately, most plants do not tolerate salt-laden soils. This is because at low concentrations, salts are relatively benign, but at high concentrations, they negatively impact the soil structure. Furthermore, the osmotic stress that saline soils impose on plants, as well as on microbes and soil invertebrates, prevent them from taking up sufficient amounts of water, and this leads to a state of artificial drought. In addition, excess salt ions are toxic to many plants, which brings me to halophytes. And the organizers, you can have inserted a poll question here, so please get involved and click to answer the question, what are halophytes?
Just going to take a second and wait for our responses to come in. It looks like we have a pretty knowledgeable group. Either they did their research beforehand or they're paying attention to our subtle hints so far in the presentation. So I'm just going to show this here. If you hadn't got a chance, there will be more coming soon. So we have about 90% of respondents have answered correctly, by just saying that halophytes can tolerate and in some cases even extract salt from soil.
Okay, so if we move on, in the broadest sense, halophytes are vascular plants that thrive in saline soils. Unfortunately, they only represent between 0.4 and 2% of all known terrestrial plant species. These plants can survive and they can complete their entire life cycle in media containing upwards of 200 millimolar sodium chloride. There are three mechanisms by which halophytes thrive in saline environments. They might be excluders. Excluders simply prevent salts from entering at the root. Halophytes may be accumulators, and these plants sequester the salts in the central vacuoles of their above ground tissues. Or halophytes can be a specialized category referred to as recreto-halophytes that actually excrete excess salts through glands on their leaf surfaces. In the context of remediating the soil, or in other words, removing salts from the soil, both accumulator and recreto-halophytes can be useful to us. You can click ahead, Darlene. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to start with the accumulator halophytes. The first thing you do is plant them. and many accumulator halophytes have been identified worldwide. It's important to select and work with native species, of which there are many dryland and some semi-aquatic ones as well in Ontario and throughout Canada. We allow the plants to grow. The salt ions are taken up by the roots. They're moved through the xylem sap into the shoots, or the above ground parts of the plant, and they're sequestered or stored in the central cell vacuoles. Once sequestered, the salts don't interfere with the general metabolic requirements of the plant. So if you think about it, at this point, we've simply moved the salt from the soil matrix into the plant matrix. So the next step is that we actually need to harvest the plants in order to remove the salts from the site. And I've put it in red because this is the labor-intensive part. However, when you think about it, rather than excavating and moving soil from a large area, plants can be grown over a number of seasons. They can be harvested and then composted or otherwise compacted. The end result is that you remove a few barrels or boxes of highly contaminated material rather than many, many truckloads of soil. So this is really a volume reduction technology. Moreover, the quality of the soil that's left in place is improved, and this important natural resource, the soil that's taken, in some cases, centuries to be created, is not lost to us. And finally, because the contaminant is salt, we can actually repurpose that salty plant biomass in a number of different ways. As I said, we might choose to compost it, but we can also, in some cases, use it as feed and fodder for livestock. We could pyrolyze it into biochar, which is another useful soil amendment, and it can even be used to produce biofuels. Halophytes work quite differently. Only a small number of halophytes are able to secrete salts from their leaves. There's about 370 halophyte species that have been identified globally at this time, and they're very widely distributed. In Canada, we have about 15 native Canadian halophytes. So excess salts are secreted through salt glands on the leaf surfaces as concentrated liquid droplets. Go back, please. As the droplets dry, the salts crystallize out. I chose these three pictures to illustrate a progression of salt accumulation that you might see on halophytes. So on the far left, on the sea thrift, you can see the secretion of almost individual crystals. Over time, the salt builds up, and so the way you see it in the middle picture in the inland salt grass, you get a bit of accumulation. And then we can get a buildup of salt crystals like on the prairie cordgrass on the far right over time, if the conditions of temperature and humidity are working with us. And we get almost like a cotton candy kind of cloud of salt. So how does this excretion of salt help us? Well, this is where we go into this process of haloconduction. So again, in halophytes, parts 1 and 2 here, the salts are taken up just like they are in accumulator halophytes, but instead of being sequestered and stored in the central vacuoles, they're excreted onto the leaves through the salt glands. You can see my little inset of a scanning electron micrograph. You can actually look at the individual little crystals. Once those salts accumulate, when the wind blows, you get movement of the salt particles into the air column. And those salt particles will become diluted with increasing distance from the source and will eventually be deposited on the soil at a distance from the site. Dilution is not generally an acceptable strategy for dealing with pollutants. However, we're dealing with salt here, and at low concentrations, the components like potassium and chloride, not to mention magnesium, calcium, etc., these are essential macro or micronutrients for plants. So most halophytes will begin secreting measurable levels of salts after about 2 years of growth. So keep that in mind. It takes a little longer to establish and get going with this mechanism of phytoremediation. However, once the plants are mature and are secreting salts, the need to harvest them is eliminated. In my lab, we've modeled haloconduction and salt dispersion in a previous study and have shown that the salt disperses to a distance of at least 5 kilometers and is deposited at levels well below background. So we do believe this to be a viable option for remediation. I'm now going to pass off to my graduate student, Lauren Nayroth, to present some of the research from our recently completed master's thesis.
Thanks for the introduction, Barb. So as Lindsay had mentioned, we established a pilot plot in Ontario. So we chose 4 halophyte species to be planted at this location. Sidewalks, grama, and prairie cordgrass are the 2 excretor halophytes, and switchgrass and sand dropseed are the 2 accumulator halophytes. All of these species are native to Ontario, and yeah. So since there are no provincial or federal guidelines for soil chloride contamination, the background level for chloride is determined on a site-to-site basis to determine the threshold for remediation. During preliminary soil sampling, I established the chloride levels range from 20 milligrams per kilogram of soil up to a maximum of 500 milligrams per kilogram. So the goal of remediation at this site will be to reduce the chloride levels back to the 20 milligram per kilogram background level. Due to the heterogeneous nature of chloride in soil, when the plot was being established, it was thoroughly homogenized using a rototiller to try to equalize the chloride concentrations throughout and give equal opportunity to all of the species planted. However, soil samples taken post-homogenization to the root depth of the plants averaged around 365 milligrams per kilogram throughout the plots. So this field site consists of 5 individual plots, 1 for each of the 4 halophytes planted, plus a control plot to see what would grow opportunistically. The accumulators here are shown in white and the excretors are shown in yellow. Large plots of 2 meters by 6 meters were chosen as opposed to multiple small plots to minimize edge effects as well as simulate a larger remediation area. Due to the later start to the growing season, plant seedlings were purchased from a variety of local nurseries to ensure that the plants had a good chance at establishing. In the first year of this study, the plants were transplanted on June 17th of 2022, and they received very regular weeding and watering over the course of the 2022 summer, and were really able to thrive at this location. So here's just a bit of a progression throughout the summer. This was in July, the next in August, and then finally in September. So this was the end of season growth. Switchgrass and prairie cordgrass grew best in these conditions. At the final harvest, I took 5 plant samples from each of the species to analyze their chloride uptake. As well as half of the accumulator plots were harvested. So pictured here on the left is the switchgrass plot that we harvested for composting. When the biomass was harvested, we cut as close to the ground as we could, leaving the roots in the plot because all of these plants are perennial grasses and will come back on their own as long as the roots were intact. So this would be similar to mowing and roadside applications. However, we noticed that there was no difference in growth between the regrown switchgrass and the unharvested switchgrass, which is a great find. Here you can see in the right-hand picture that the thatch from the previous year is visible, but overall the performance of the plants was not impacted by this form of harvesting. In 2023, 3 out of the 4 species grew back successfully. It looks like the sand dropseed plot in the front left did really well. Unfortunately, that isn't the plant that we want there. It grew back very sparingly with only about 6 plants that we wanted to be found in the entire plot. In 2024, we are planning on replacing it with rough dropseed. This is just another progression through the 2023 season. By July, the plants were larger than in 2022 and growing well. And then finally, in August of 2023, they were still doing a really fantastic job. So this brings me into calculating the timeline for remediation. So there are several factors to consider when trying to calculate how long it will take for these plants to remediate an area, like the amount of chloride in the soil, the biomass production of each of the species, and the amount of chloride being taken up by the plants. So in this case, I analyzed the soil column to find where the majority of the chloride contamination, was. And this was found to be within the top 15 centimeters below the soil surface. So this is the area that these calculations account for, and also where the majority of the root mass of the plants is located. So first, the literature was consulted for the optimal biomass production of the species used. All of these values are given in grams of dry weight plant matter per meter squared. In the field, we observed higher than expected biomass production in prairie cordgrass and switchgrass. Prairie cordgrass here is an excretor and switchgrass is an accumulator. The excretor species are being analyzed the same way as the accumulator species here because in their first growing seasons, there was not sufficient growth to facilitate and quantify substantial salt excretion. However, in upcoming seasons, the plants will be washed for the excretor species to measure the amount of salt that they're able to excrete. The chloride uptake per square meter was determined by averaging the accumulation of chloride from the 5 plants that I harvested at the end of the season and multiplying this by the observed biomass. Now we know how much chloride can be taken up by each plant in a kind of square meter area. And as you can see, all the levels for all of the plants were quite high, the highest being prairie cordgrass, which happens to be an excretor. And these values are on par or better than literature values for these species. So knowing the capacity of the plants to take up chloride from soil, we need to determine the amount of chloride in the soil as well. So I calculated the amount of chloride in soil using soil density as well as the measured chloride concentration from samples taken. So there was a large variability in chloride between species plots. So rather than taking a total mean, I calculated it on a specific species plot basis. So the numbers are quite different, as you can see. And this is not unusual as it's extremely difficult to homogenize soil contamination concentrations in the field. I then calculated the final phytoremediation timelines by dividing the amount of chloride in the species-specific plot by the amount that was able to be extracted by the plants. So 3 out of the 4 species are projected to remediate this location in under a 10-year time frame, and as well as low as 2 years for prairie cordgrass. Prairie cordgrass also has the added benefit of being an excretor and will disperse the salt on its own from the area and in situ applications once it's mature. The 2 accumulators are projected to perform well. However, sandropsy did not reestablish in 2023 and is being replaced in 2024. The other excretor we have, Cytodes produces much less biomass comparatively to the other grasses, which is why its timeline is so much longer at just over 13 years. But keep in mind, once this species matures, it will also be excreting, so there's still potential for this species to be a good candidate for remediation. Now we have a few polling questions before we get into more discussion.
So this is really just to gauge interest in halophytes. So just give us a little poll of your interest in signage indicating halophytes on your site. Once we have a few answers here, we'll post this up. Looks like there is some interest in there, so really great to see. We also have another poll just to gauge some interest even further. I can do this. There we go. So would your organization be interested in trialing these plants on your land to inform guidelines, checklists, and so forth? Everyone's on the ball with these polls now. We're getting the hang of this. Waiting for a couple more stragglers. Awesome. Seems like there's quite a bit of interest, which is great. And then one more just to nail the point home. So would your organization be interested in hosting a community planting focused on halophytes? This is not a commitment to anyone, more of just gauging some interest. And that's great. Looks like we have some conversations to be had after the webinar. This is great. So we're going to move on to Paula.
Thank you so much. When I was first asked to present at this conference, I immediately said yes. I was just so very excited about the results that I've seen so far from the trials. MTO started this project because we are a partial funder, I suppose. We have a program whereby universities who are conducting research can partner with MTO to help offset some of the costs of their work. If I could have the next slide, please. So I'm sure you think that MTO is a major contributor of salt to our environment, and you are right, we are fairly major. I don't think we're actually the highest, but we do contribute quite a bit, so that makes us very salty in a fashion. There are three types of salts that we use: sodium, magnesium, and calcium chloride. And the reason we use three different kinds is they function at different temperatures. So at lower temperatures, we use sodium chloride. For the majority of sites, we use magnesium chloride. And in places where it's very, very cold, so the northern portion of the province, we use calcium chloride. And this is all very necessary. One of our mandates is to help passengers move safely and reliably across the province. So the use of various chlorides helps us to do that. Now we've actually reduced by a fair amount the amount of salts that we've used in the past. Further research and methods, times of applications have all shown us that we don't need to use quite as much as we have. But the salts that we do have greatly impact the green infrastructure, which is my area of expertise. So I am the caretaker of that green environment, and I work with many of our departments, including our environmental planners and our maintenance departments, to try and do the best we can in the green spaces. Unfortunately, the salts have quite a negative effect. They affect our soils by increasing compaction. Excuse me. They have a negative effect on our turf. So many times our turf doesn't survive, and they have a negative effect on our plants. We spend a great deal of time researching what should actually survive, but that's almost a bit of a trial and error effort. We also have problems of runoff. So not only does the salt travel through the air, but it runs off of our lands when it hasn't been absorbed and flows into our waterways. So that could be through the swales or through soil percolation. Once it hits the groundwater, it then travels into the various sensitive water bodies. So we do anything that we can to try and prevent that. And my next slide, please. So one of the things that we've discovered in the past is that we've had great success with native grasses. And these are not necessarily turf grasses, but really native grasses and forbs that we use. and we've had good success with them, particularly in West Region, where they're being used more frequently. And one of the exciting things is that when I first became involved in this salt study, they listed the plants that we used, and my ears perked up because I'm the person in charge of the specification for vegetative cover, which includes the seed mixes. And most of our seed mixes, the native seed mixes, already had a lot of those types of grasses in them, and it would be very easy to add the ones that this study recommends. So we certainly look forward to making those changes and coming up with seed mixes that are primarily the grasses that have been studied, so that they can have a very positive effect and help to protect areas adjacent to sensitive water bodies. So we look forward to the next stage of this study, and it's always presented so beautifully and easy to understand. And I have presented it to my seniors, and they are also very excited. So best of luck and thank you. And I now pass this on to Danielle.
Thanks, Paula. Much appreciated. So as we went through today, really appreciate all the other speakers talking about halophytes and salt tolerance. But as Paula mentioned, one of the big things we have to focus on, especially for a lot of the municipalities on the call, unfortunately, even with higher levels of chloride is just, it's a necessity. We have to look forward and actually say, how can we reduce our chloride use, especially as municipalities, as contractors, as private business operators? How can we still use salt, which is a necessity just based on general economics of salt use in comparison to some other alternatives? But how can we reduce our reliance on them? We're still trying to make sure we're reducing our liability on private properties, liability on roadways, reducing crashes, but still being able to use it just in a more limited amount. And next slide, please. Thank you. And so one of the things we've gone through over the last couple of years is we've updated our low impact development, LIDs, or green infrastructure, our planning and design guideline. And one of those things that came into that was the impacts of salt. So we've gone through, this is a web page. If you're associated or work with green infrastructure or low impact developments, we've updated our 2010 guide. We've made it a fully functional LID guide wiki website. So this is an evergreen product. We can constantly go in, we change it week to week. We have 530 plus pages. And one of the many pages we have on here are the impacts of salt in the environment. And one of those effects we just have at the line graph at the top is just showing the benefits of not only using halophytes, but looking to use green infrastructure to help slow the spread of chloride into our receiving water bodies. So the example we have here, we have the acute and chronic, which are set at 640 milligrams per liter for acute chloride guidance set by the Canadian Council of Ministers of Environment, CCME, and the chronic level, which is 120 milligrams per liter. So the example we're showing here over a monitoring season from June 2011 to June 2012, we saw spreading rock salt just on your typical asphalt parking lot comparatively to spreading it on permeable pavement. And then as a final example with bioretention, and we're able to see the actual spread and actually effluent of kind of chloride, heavily chloride laden kind of water and runoff coming off these facilities was severely reduced when using LIDs. More specifically, a vegetative practice like bioretention that can try and utilize salt-tolerant or halophytic species like were mentioned today. And we go into a couple more of those details of how chloride also affects our human health, environment, and our built infrastructure. So looking around best management practices and potential de-icer alternatives is something we've been doing research on over the past decade. So now what we've done is with some of this research, we've gone out and we've looked at developing guidance. A lot of municipalities use private contractors to clear their snow on their municipally owned assets and buildings. But even large corporations, they'll hire private companies that will come out and do salt spreading practices for them. So what we developed back in 2019 is our procurement guidance. So going through and as big clientele, both municipalities as well as large corporations alike, you are these salt contractors, you are their largest clients. And the best way to get ahead of reducing your salt practice is doing it before salt is even spread. And that's where we develop this procurement guidance, where the focus on this is for parking lots, but there are some best practices that can be applied to roadways. But the emphasis is on optimizing salt use. Training, some of you might be aware of Smart About Salt Council. This group goes out and trains salt spreading contractors to make sure that they're optimizing their salt use. So they're actually saving money on the salt they're using and spreading to reduce the impacts to the environment. And it's trained them on how to use better calibration techniques for their equipment they use, or install new equipment on their different vehicles that they use to try and look at different alternatives used. Examples would be brine or direct liquid application, pre-wetting processes, or even using other alternatives like agricultural ones, like a beet juice alternative. So we go through some of those key practices and potential to reduce salt, but we've also developed sample contract wording. So going through and how do you want this contract to be worded to make sure you're reducing the amount of salt you're using per year. We have that developed. Plus, we've put in there making sure that you're saving money as well. Finally, another big kind of piece when we look at is best management practices for snow and ice control. So both on parking lots as well as walkways. So a lot of that is with this development. This is our more recent, kind of research paper we put out there, where we kind of did a market research, actually surveying and reaching out to the contractors themselves. What are they already doing, and what do they kind of want to look to do? And how can we minimize the cost going forward? One of the biggest things we keep coming back to with these contractors is the concerns of their legal liability, slips, trips, and falls. We have that kind of image showcased here with the person falling up the steps. So how are we making sure that they don't have to worry about rising insurance rates, which are happening in this province for themselves, but still making sure that they're protecting their bottom line and they can actually reduce the amount that they're spreading on site. So a lot of those practices that we addressed and guidelines that they can consider for new best management practices are some alternatives and alternative materials. So I mentioned before, pre-treating your surfaces before snowfall. So actually having brine being applied, or pre-wetting your salt. So the practice of actually, as it's being spread, you have on your spinner, you're pre-wetting that salt so it actually adheres to the roadway. About 20 to even 30% of salt actually bounces off the roadway and then just ends up where you don't want it, which usually ends up in our ditch systems and our heavily laden kind of vegetated areas around our roadways and parking lots. So pre-wetting is a great example of this. Direct liquid application, and again, using brine, which is 23% NaCl to 77% water. So you're actually using a brine mixture, which adheres to the roadway much quicker than salt. And reducing chemical plowing. What we mean by chemical plowing, you'll hear some contractors say, oh, they're just burning the snow right away. So instead of plowing, they're just spreading a high level of salt, which is melting or burning the snow quickly. And then we talk about decision-making tools. There's machine learning, AI, and actually using weather systems and forecasting. Okay, if we're expecting this amount of snow, this is the rate at which we're applying the salt. So a lot of municipalities, York Region, for example, is using MDSS type systems. Many other regional municipalities and lower tier municipalities are doing this as well. But then also, where is your salt being stored on site? Either as a municipality, as a contractor, or as a business owner. Where are you keeping it so you're not having it go directly into our water systems or into the environment? Staff training on site, and then property manager kind of best practices. How can they protect their clientele and actually their staff coming in and off of site? And we talked about other different alternative surface courses. Actually having an LID like permeable pavers, you're increasing the grit factor, which allows you to make sure you're adhering your shoes to the walkway when you're walking. And having that as an alternative to typical asphalt can help with reducing your salt spreading. So we have our case study summaries where we pulled this within the appendices of that document as well. There's just a quick image of the title page of that document. So we also have some other research we've done with our partners. I did introduce STEP, Sustainable Technology Evaluation Program. We're collaborative ourselves at TRCA. Our partners and sister CAs to the north of us, Lake Simcoe Region Conservation Authority, LSRCA, and then the Credit Valley Conservation to the west of us out in Peel Region. So we've gone through and actually looked at several low chloride organic liquids. So those examples, as I mentioned kind of before, are the examples of using beet juice, calcium chloride, magnesium chloride, as Paula mentioned before, and then pre-treating some rock salts. Thaw rocks is a very popular one that's used by some municipalities like Aurora. Acetate deicers, commonly used by actually landing strips for airports, and then whey and wheat-based kind of starches. So there's some other examples for reducing salt that way. Now, a lot of our research has shown this, or external research has showed, yes, we can reduce our chloride, but we also have to be considerate of what other contaminants can enter the environment with these alternatives. So looking at using beet juice, great alternative, but we have seen there's been higher potassium loading, which is actually killing early stage mussel species here in Ontario in the waterways. So making sure we're kind of balancing that, and kind of future research is needed to make sure what alternatives are kind of a best alternative moving forward at a holistic approach for the environment. And looking at nutrient impacts on streams, less likely on roads drained by ditches. So we have research all the way back from 2011 actually showing having vegetated ditch species, whether they have salt-tolerant species or not, could be great examples of early stages of kind of reducing our salt loading that enters our receiving water bodies. And we have links to our alternatives to salt, alternatives to sand or high grit factor kind of spreaded material, and evaluation of organic anti-icing. So those are all included within your slides after today's session. And that's it for me. I just include some additional links. We have our winter salt management, all our research we've done to date from 2010 forward, and then our STEP LID Planning and Design Guide wiki website on all things kind of road salt, winter kind of management, and source water protection, and how low impact developments can help out with that, along with my contact details. And now I'm actually going to turn it back to Lindsay, and she's going to kind of go over our kind of finishing touches on today's session.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. So now we've heard why salt is an environmental issue and how both phytoremediation and salt reduction through improved management are part of the solution. Since the phytoremediation knowledge we've gained in this pilot project is relatively new, we're working on guidelines or checklists right now to assist organizations interested in implementing this biotechnology as a next step. So thanks to everyone who replied to the poll. We will be in touch. There may not be a one-size-fits-all solution, but as a start, we have provided a summary of information on halophytes on PPG's website at the link here. And we have also added these species to the plant list that's provided by STEP in their wiki that Daniel mentioned. It contains more information on planting conditions that are suitable for these species, such as soil moisture or shade tolerance. And just before we move into the Q&A section, I want to mention to please feel free to reach out to any of us. Our emails are here with any further questions or comments after the webinar.
Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you to all our presenters for an interesting and informative webinar. We will now open it up for questions. We have quite a few of them, so we'll get through them very quickly. The first question, I think maybe Barbara, this is for you. If you compost these accumulators, are you then reintroducing the salt to the environment?
Oh, yes, the composted, the plant biomass, the salty plant biomass needs to be removed from the site, and then we would compost it. And you would not reintroduce it to the site unless you took the time to wash the salts out of the composted matter. In that case, you would have clean biomass and you could put it back onto your site, but you wouldn't just leave it in place. Does that answer the question?
I hope so. The second one is, again, I think for you. If the accumulator halophytes could be composted, why is it necessary to harvest them? Is this more about dilution of the salt as opposed to removing them from the environment entirely?
I'm just not sure about how that was worded. So we're not going to compost the biomass until it's been cut and removed from the site. So when you go to compost, you would cut at the ground surface, and you would remove that salty biomass to another location, usually a central location, where you've got a liner in place, and you could now compost that plant biomass. And you're going for volume reduction again here. Again, it's salt. So I mean, I've done this with metal contaminated biomass and organochlorines, etc. Salts tends to be easier, especially if we're dealing with some of these native grasses, because they break down in compost very readily. So we'll get a much lower volume of contaminated biomass. And because it's salt, we can even wash the salt out of that biomass if we choose to.
Thank you, Barbara. Well, the next one is, are you aware of any native tree species that have halophytic properties? Who wants to answer?
Yeah, I am not. We do have some more salt-tolerant trees, but we don't tend to use them because, again, we're looking to do more than just move the salt from the soil matrix into the plant matrix. We then want to remove it. And so what we want is something that grows very quickly and with lots of biomass. And trees tend to grow more slowly. So we do tend to use native fast-growing plants.
Thank you. I'm just going to get through the questions quickly. We have
Sure.
quite a few, and I know we have time. We have another 10 minutes more. Should we run into a situation where we have more questions, I think all the speakers have graciously agreed to stay on if you have the time for a few more minutes. There was one more that said, I think I'll combine two questions. Do you have recommendations on the best strategic locations to plant halophytes? And there was another similar one which said, where do you recommend planting halophytes? Are they better suited to highways, or are they applicable to smaller side street and residential areas too?
I believe halophytes can be used in a number of different applications. So I like the idea of using halophyte grasses as sort of a barrier on the edges of highways, but we have used them in all kinds of different industrial applications as well. And especially if we get into the credo halophytes. And again, I'm happy to follow up with anyone in person if they have more specific questions later.
Yeah, I think that's what we want to kind of think about when we're developing those guidelines for landowners is, work with the landowners on their own properties and look around. It'll give us an idea of where potential is, but we can also think about things like snow dump sites. So where you are piling the snow after plowing, anywhere that's going to drain off of a parking lot, where there's salt applied. So we have some, ideas of where there would be salt contamination, but again, we're interested in working with some of those landowners to develop those.
Okay. Darlene has just mentioned that there are a few hands that have been raised. So maybe I have a few more questions here through the Q&A.
Sure.
But Darlene, do you just want to go ahead and take maybe two questions?
Sure. Yeah, we had our first hand up from Jeremy. Jeremy, would you like to ask your question? Just have to unmute yourself.
Hi, I'm sorry, are you talking to me?
Yep.
I did not raise my hand. I'm not sure how that was shown. Sorry about that.
No problem.
That's okay.
We have another question, or another hand up at least, from Brent. Brent, would you like to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Can you hear us, Brent? Okay, that's fine.
We accidentally pressed it. Okay,
That's fine. Okay, I'll move on. We have another question here. It's about your studies are focused on remediation, but could these species be used in salt-prone areas, for example, ditches, roads, wetlands, to allow municipalities or cities to be more proactive before remediation is required, especially for species that won't require post-harvesting?
Definitely.
Absolutely. a wonderful idea.
Yeah, like as Barb said, definitely as like barriers along roadsides can reduce the, I guess, direct impact.
All right. I think, Lauren, there are a couple of questions posed to you. For the chloride reduction study of the test site, have you looked at how much chloride percolated down into the groundwater at the test site and surrounding areas?
No, we did not look at how much percolated through.
We did look through the soil column. You could talk about those results.
Yeah, like the majority of the chloride concentration was still within that top 15 centimeters. So I think it was minimal, if any, had been washed through the soil column, I guess, to groundwater sources.
Okay. And for recreator halophytes, are recreator halophytes expected to be studied later in your study? Are there other studies we should be referring to for these plants?
You can definitely look up the halophytes that I mentioned in like Google Scholar or through any like university library and be able to find like the plant name and halophyte. You'll be able to find some studies associated there. As well, another master's student will be taking over my research at this location and will be keeping it going for the next couple of years. So hopefully there will be some new data coming out in the fall.
Thank
There's
you.
actually very little on recreto halophytes to date, but I can share a paper that actually looked at salt uptake by recreto halophytes and modeled where that salt ended up over time. And I can share that with the participants after this webinar.
Thank you, Bob. Just a reminder, the recording, slides, and all these resources would be available to all participants and attendees on our website. So Darlene will be sending out an email indicating that as well. There was a comment, I think, in the chat and a question. It says, Phragmites, we know it's tolerant of brackish water. Does it accumulate any significant amount of salt?
It does. I've worked with Phragmites a fair bit. And in fact, I've worked with the invasive haplotype, which happens to take out large quantities of salt. So at one of my industrial sites, we were able to grow the Phragmites that was already there. Because it's the invasive haplotype, we couldn't, obviously didn't want to introduce any new Phragmites, but by removing it, we were removing salt and the invasive plant at the same time.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for a great webinar. For the excreta plants, aren't you just redistributing the salt to the environment? Even if the deposition rate is low, the overall mass will be the same.
Absolutely, but again, the components of salt, these ions like chloride, magnesium, calcium, these are micro and macronutrients that all plants need. And so by redistributing them at lower concentrations, it's actually a benefit to a lot of different plants. Salts are really only toxic at high concentrations. And so if we can disperse that, that's actually a very good thing to do. And again, as I say, that's completely different from just about every other contaminant I've ever worked with.
Thank you. Why not just use sand on low-speed roadways and then street sweep in the spring? Maybe Paula, this is for you.
That's an interesting question. The sand only adds traction. The sand won't do anything in terms of melting the ice or preventing the ice or melting the snow. So without that, you will get traction, but the roads will still be slippery.
Just to add on to Paula's point, the other big thing that municipalities facing now is a lot of that sand is ending up in stormwater catch basins and are entering stormwater management ponds. And as we know now, the average clean out of these ponds that have to happen on average about every 25 years is now $500,000 up to $1 million, depending where you're located in each municipality. So if you're adding more sand, you're reducing that maintenance timeline from 25 years down. And municipalities have to start planning out how they're going to be cleaning out these ponds, depending how many they have their jurisdiction. So there are some other considerations with sand that comes up with cost.
I'm conscious of time, but we have 2 more questions, so I'll quickly get through those. How deep out of the soil can salt be pulled by the plants? Will halophytes work to remediate groundwater with increasing salt concentrations?
It depends entirely on the depth of the root system of the plants, and that will vary depending on the plant species. So somebody had mentioned trees earlier, and we do have some very fast-growing trees, some of our willows and poplars that put down very deep roots very quickly that can access groundwater, and they've been used to remediate other types of contaminants in the past. But when we are working with native forbs and grasses, we're usually looking at the top, probably ½ meter of soil that they can access.
Okay. All right. And the final question, is there a threshold for salt these plants can tolerate? Lindsay or Daniel, who wants to take this?
No, I go to Barb.
Yeah, okay. So yes, there is a threshold. Each plant species has its own threshold, however. By definition, we say halophytes are anything that can take out more than 200 nanomolar. However, some species can tolerate much higher levels than others.
Okay. But I think the final message there is to still, which Daniel mentioned, is the need to still reduce salt use.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you to all our attendees for joining us and being such an engaging audience with all the questions. And thank you to all our presenters once again on behalf of Partners in Project Green. I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.